Good morning. Today's scripture reading comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 29, starting in verse 1, and I'll be reading from the ESV today. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, the Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon to skip like a calf, and Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth and strips the forests bare. And in the temple all cry, "Glory!" The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace.
He asked me recently to bring a word to you all this morning, so here I am. So despite all the negative press that Disney has been getting recently, everyone in this room has to acknowledge that Disney knows what appeals to audiences, both young and old, right? Their cartoons have broad appeal. If I say movies like Beauty and the Beast or The Little Mermaid or Lion King, or even recent movies like Frozen or Encanto, almost everybody in here can remember those movies and the stories and the songs there. Now, recently I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, which is called Podcasts for Nerdy Christians, where faith meets fandom. And it's moderated by two Episcopal priests and has the tagline of this: a podcast for progressive Christians who love Hogwarts, hobbits, Jedi, and Jesus. Now, I know in saying this, I've already lost some of you. Y'all are rolling your eyes, but stick with me, I promise. On a recent podcast, they were talking about I Want songs in Disney movies. And apparently the second song in most Disney movies has an I Want theme in it. I never really noticed this before. Where the primary character presents their desire or petition, a prayer word, and then over the course of the movie, we see how that want is answered or how that petition is met or transformed. You see, Disney realizes that this theme resonates with young and often older audiences who are looking for their place in the world. They're almost always these energizing songs, and they often even have the phrase, I want, in them. Let me give you some examples. And no singing, it will be going on in your head, but I'm not going to sing. I sang like 2 sermons ago, and my kids were like, Dad, it was good until that point, so I promise I won't sing. Ariel says, I want to be where the people are. I want to see them dancing, walking around on, what do you call them? Oh, feet. And then Belle in Beauty and the Beast, in her second song, in the second song of the movie, says, there must be more than this provincial life, because, she wants adventure somewhere else. Entangled, the second song, When Will My Life Begin? Rapunzel is up in her tower doing chores, sweeping, and other things. But at the very end of the song, she says, I really wonder what it's like to be out there. In Frozen, the second song is, Do You Want to Build a Snowman? And interestingly, this song is about Anna's desire to be in a relationship with her sister. And she says, I want you to let me in. And y'all remember the end where she's sitting outside that door, those of you who've seen that movie. Recently, I was taking kids home from a birthday party in my car, and they wanted to listen to a recent Disney movie soundtrack called Encanto. Some of you have seen this movie. And so I turned it on for them, and they just started belting the songs. I see some of you in the crowd remembering that. And in the second song, Maribel says this: I don't have these gifts that my family has. I can't move mountains. I can't make flowers bloom. I can't take another night up in my room waiting on a miracle. I would heal what's broken and show this family something new, who I am inside. So what can I do? I'm sick of waiting on a miracle, so here I am. I'm ready. So the moderators of the podcast, they say this: all these I Want songs, the characters are telling themselves and telling the audience what they think their story is about, and what they want their story to be about. But then the rest of the movie is how that desire and I want is transformed, and that's what kind of grabs us. Now, really, isn't this kind of what petitionary prayer is about as well? We all ask these questions of place, where am I going? A question of person or identity, who am I? Or maybe a question of purpose, why am I here? Look back over your prayers over the last week or months or years and ask how many times you've asked or even yearned for these kind of same questions. And if we have to be honest, all too often we're kind of disappointed with the silence that follows. We desperately want to hear God's answer, his voice, and make things clear in our life. So what does this have to do with Psalm 29? 7 times in this passage, the most oft-repeated phrase is the voice of the Lord. And in February, I was meditating on this passage, and that jumped out at me because I felt like the psalmist was saying, pay attention. The voice of the Lord, the voice of the Lord, the voice of the Lord. And he keeps on saying it. So this morning, I want to take this passage and use as a template for noticing different aspects of God's voice and see how God's voice sometimes comes in unexpected ways. And then we'll come back at the very end and return and see what God's voice gives us. So my 3 points are learning to hear, the unexpected voice of God, and what God's voice gives. Let me pray real quick. Lord, thank you for the chance to gather this morning and look at your word and meditate upon it. And I pray that you would help us to, we just pray that you quiet our hearts and help us to hear your voice. Pray to use me and the words that I say to speak your word. And we pray all this in your precious holy name. Amen. So learning to hear. In Psalm 29, what is the posture we see the psalmist take when he approaches God? What is the very first word? It's ascribe, right? And this word is actually repeated 3 different times in the opening verses. So what is the psalmist telling us to do if we're going to hear God's voice? This Hebrew word habu is translated best, perhaps, in King James Version, which says given to. But I really like the way the Message says it. It starts the passage with, bravo, God, bravo. So if we're going to approach God and hear his voice, how do we do that? What's the posture we need to take? It has to start with worship. And Mark is always reminding us of this, especially as we talk about petitionary prayer. You see, we're quick to take the same path that Disney songs take. We say things like, I want to be king, or I want to be part of that world, or if they could just see me. And are we really any different? We often will approach prayer with us, me, my wants, especially as we approach those questions of person, place, and purpose. What is God doing with my life? Doesn't he get me? What in the world am I supposed to do next? And I think these are fair questions, but we have to start just like the Message and say, bravo, God, bravo. The next part of the passage is one of my favorite parts. Where do we hear God's voice? Now, you remember Mark, some of you are like, hey, this sounds familiar. And that's because Mark actually preached on this passage 8 months ago. I told him I was going to take a little bit different route, but I really like what Mark said about this part of the passage. And so I want you to look at the passage kind of like a weather map. Often, y'all will pull out your phones and you'll click on the map and you'll see kind of where the storms are and how it's moving and if it's going to affect you and where the red and yellow and all that kind of stuff. And so I have asked a slide to be popped up. Now, I know that if you're in the back, you're not going to see it. So I brought my laser pointer. In a second, I'm going to step away, and I know the people online will be able to hear my voice. But verse 3, it says the storm gathers over waters. And it was thought that this was the Mediterranean. And you can see that on the map, the big body of water to the west. And then in verse 5, it moves east over Lebanon, which is on the top part of the map. And then next, it moves south to Syrian, which is actually another name for Mount Hermon, mentioned in this passage, north of Israel. And finally, the storm moves southeast to the wilderness of Kadesh. And you see this in verse 8. And Mark said in his sermon, they thought this was Petra, which is modern-day Jordan. So just for a second, I'll step away. I'm going to use my laser pointer and show you what I'm talking about. So the Mediterranean, bit south of Syria and cut off on the map. So when I preach, I have all this nervous energy, so it's really hard to stand still like this. So that was good for me. So what is the psalmist saying in this passage? He is saying that God, just like a storm, swoops over the land. And y'all know this, especially living in Greenville. We'll have storms kind of come in, and they'll swoop in and swoop out. The clouds will gather, and they'll come and take you off guard if you're not careful. And then it'll be sunny, like 5 minutes later, it seems. So what does this have to do with God's voice? Where can we find God's voice? If you look, it's over the waters, brewing over the ocean. I think about, obviously, if you've been out to the ocean on a boat, you really can appreciate this. But even just going to the ocean and thinking about God there, some of you meet God best beside the ocean, right? Or thundering loudly in storms. I don't know about you, but one of my favorite singer, Andrew Peterson, says he loves to go out on his porch and sit in a rocking chair and just hear the heavens thunder. In fact, that's his favorite word for those of you that like him. Or we see it in the forest glades and in the sanctuary of trees. Once a week, I try to escape to Lake Conisty, and I walk through with my dogs and just listen. I try not to think, which is really hard. Or in the passage, he talks about lightning cracks and flashes. And so you hear that loud crack, and it really makes us shake. I used to have a dog. Most of our dogs do this anyways, but I used to have a dog that when it happened, it would just shake like this the whole time because it could hear the lightning. You also see it in the desert, shaking the desert, which is an earthquake, which is kind of cool too. And then he talks about twisting oaks and stripping forest. And so you get the picture of a tornado coming through. Over the flood, it mentions at the very end, which is probably an allusion back to the flood in Noah's day. And then finally, you see God's voice in the temple with God enthroned. So what does this say? This says that God's voice is everywhere. And it moves through the land with force and power. I think too often we relegate God to here. This is when we hear God, with preaching of the word, which is super important. But this is the time when we listen for God. But this passage is reminding us that we can find God in lots of different places, in lots of different ways. We may hear it in the quiet places, in the birth of a deer in the forest, or in the mountain heights, down by the sea, or even in the temple, in the wilderness and deserts and floods. And our wilderness, our deserts, our floods. There's no nook or cranny where his voice is not speaking, and the psalmist uses nature to convey all the places we can hear him. You see, we see that God's voice is not just everywhere, but it's also multifaceted. It can't be stifled. It shouts from the mountaintops and whispers in the silence of the forest. So what are characteristics of his voice? I've kind of already hinted at a lot of these. How are we going to listen? Well, mainly, the psalmist is describing a storm. And I remember we had some tornado warnings about a year or so ago that were dangerously close to my home. And so it was the first time, for some silly reason, that we were really scared because it just seemed like it was so close. And so we tried to figure out what room in our house was the safest. And Haley and I discovered that there was no safe room in our house. Or one without windows, or one that was central. And so we brought all our family and tried to fit them inside the laundry room, which is there wasn't much room. My kids can remember this. And then there's too many of us to sleep inside that room because the tornado warnings weren't going away. And so then we split our family up, which was scary within itself. And the other half went inside a closet somewhere in the house. So we only found 2 places that were kind of safe. And as we sat there with the kids, and y'all have done this before, I'm sure, we heard the wind hitting the walls and whistling and the thunder and the lightning. And then occasionally it would get really quiet, but then it would get loud again. And y'all know that fear. Well, the psalmist is hearing that and seeing that, and he's describing that here in this passage. His voice thunders. It's powerful. It's majestic. It has the strength to snap cedars, kind of like a tornado snapping a toothpick. Cedars like a toothpick. It makes calves leap and mountains skip. The voice shakes the desert. As I said, he's describing an earthquake. It flashes with fire. It strips forest. So here's my question. Can we miss God's voice? No. Do you think the people in the temple miss it in the passage? No. If you look in verse 9, the people's response is glory. They realize that God's voice is powerful. And then once again, I really love the way the Message translates this verse. It says, the people, we fall to our knees and we call out glory. When was the last time that happened to you? You heard God's voice and all you could do was fall on your knees and cry glory. So we've learned lots of things about God's voice here in this passage. If we're to hear him, we need to approach him with a heart of worship. His voice is everywhere. It can't be missed. We just need ears to hear. And that his voice is powerful. But I want to pause here and look at another passage which shows God's voice showing up in an unexpected way. And I didn't have that read at the beginning because I just want to focus on a few verses in particular. So let's move, if y'all can turn in your Bibles to 1 Kings 19. And it's hard to find Old Testament passages sometimes. So while you're turning to 1 Kings 19, let me tell you a little bit about this. I love biblical stories. It's hard to preach a sermon on a psalm because I love to tell stories. Most weeks you'll find me in children's church, and so if you see occasional reference to a Disney song, for example, that's why. I'm just treating y'all like big kids. But in this passage, we find a man who had trouble hearing God's voice, at least at first. And maybe this is where you are this morning. You read the psalmist and you're like, okay, I get it. God is everywhere. I shouldn't be missing his voice, but I am. And so maybe you can this story will resonate more with you. So we're going to focus on verses 11 through 13, but let me tell you what happened. In 1 Kings 18, Elijah was God's man. And y'all have heard this story before. He's on Mount Carmel. There's a contest that occurs. 450 prophets of Baal gather, and Elijah gathers. And they try to call down fire on an altar, and Baal doesn't answer. But you all know what happens. Elijah tells everybody to dump pots of water on the altar and keep on dumping pots of water. Dump another pot of water, and then he calls down fire, and the fire comes down and melts the altar. And after that, he tells the people that are gathered there, grab the prophets of Baal and kill them, wipe them out. And they do. The problem is that in 1 Kings 19, where I just asked y'all to turn, Jezebel, who's the queen, hears about this, and these are her prophets, and she's not too happy. And so in the very first few verses, she says to Elijah, if you are still living by tomorrow, then basically I'm going to make sure you aren't living by tomorrow's time. So in chapter 19, Elijah hears this. He hears he's marked, and he decides to run off to the mountains. And so he runs off, and interestingly, we find him on Mount Horeb, which was just mentioned in the psalm we were at. And this man we find in chapter 19 is so much different than the man that we saw in chapter 18. He's despondent, he's fearful, afraid, anxious. He doesn't really know if he's going to make it to the next day. He feels kind of abandoned. You ever felt this way? You've asked God to speak into a particular life situation, and you get silence. So in verse 5 through 6, we get Elijah's real heart said in a few verses. He says, he's sitting under a bush, and he says, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Now, I know some of you felt this way before. I talk to patients almost on a weekly basis that contemplate suicide. And most of the time, people don't have a plan for suicide. They just think, probably better if I just wasn't here. I don't really see what I'm contributing to this world. And some of you can relate to that. You've just lost all motivation for living, as Elijah has here. But notice that Elijah does not presume to take his own life, though. He just would rather God do it, and he just kind of not have to show up anymore. So there's a lot in this passage, but I want you to see how God speaks to him, as that's our focus this morning. And so I want you to look at verses 11 and 12. I'll read them here. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. Now do you see why we're in this passage? In Psalm 29, God spoke through the wind and the earthquake and the fire. His voice was unmistakable. But in this passage, it says God was not in these things. Now, I think when I read this when I was a kid, I'm like, I don't see how God wasn't in it, because how does an earthquake, fire, and wind show up and God not be behind it? So certainly God sends those things, but his voice is not in those things. And so I was listening to a sermon by Tim Keller and took some of his ideas and helped me better understand this. And so just want to attribute some of these ideas to him. Let's back up a little bit before we answer this question to verses 5 through 8. See, God shows up with Elijah despondent and depressed and anxious, and see what he does first. The first thing, Elijah just falls asleep. He's tired. God lets him sleep. And then when he wakes up, before God says anything at all to him, an angel prepares a meal. And I think what this says is that there is a physical side sometimes to our depression. Sometimes we don't really need words, we just need our physical needs met. And God knows that. It'd be pretty cool to have a meal prepared by an angel. I wonder what he had. So God is tender in meeting his needs. I think it's just really cool. And then in verse 9, God asks Elijah a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? Now, you know when God asks a question, usually God knows the answer, right? So a lot of times when God asks us questions, it's to show us the answer. And he's hoping to reveal something in Elijah's heart. And out of his depression, Elijah says, I have been very zealous for the Lord Almighty. You see, this is what Elijah's saying. I tried my plan, I did your deed, and now I'm running for my life. And I'm done, God. So just take my life and get it over with. Then God calls out to him, and he witnesses the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but God is not in those things. So what God's teaching in this passage is that he can come in vast and innumerable ways. Often we set limits on God. We put him in a box. We say this is how God is supposed to come in church, for example, or through the reading of the Bible, which are true, of course. But sometimes we can't hear God in those things. And so what God is showing here, to quote Tim Keller, is that when God comes, he comes in humbling multiplicity. As y'all know, I teach children's church every week, and this is the prayer I often open up with, and you'll giggle when you'll understand why I start with this prayer. God, please help us to be quiet now, because sometimes you speak loudly, but other times you whisper, and we want to hear your voice. And in most times it does work. They get a little quieter. Instead of limiting God to only one way, look at all the ways he speaks in his word. For Moses, it was a burning bush or a fire. For the children of Israel at Sinai, it was an earthquake. For the disciples at Pentecost, it was the Holy Spirit as a wind blew. For Balaam, he used the mouth of a donkey. And here, as the King James Version puts it, God spoke in a still small voice. So let me ask you, how is God speaking in your life? Is he using a friend to speak wisdom and truth? Probably often when you don't want to hear it. Is he just meeting physical needs, something that we take too quickly for granted? Maybe he's speaking loudly, hollering at you clearly, but you won't take out your metaphorical earplugs or AirPods. You notice kids walk around with those all the time in their ears. I think the way God speaks most clearly is through his word. As Mark says, it truly is a love letter written to us. But all too often, we don't really take much time to read his word or meditate upon it. And sometimes he comes in a whisper. As the psalmist says, be still and know that I am God. That's another psalm. Here's the question. How can we be still? How can we hear his still small voice if we refuse to be still? How much silence do you find in your life? This is something, as many of you know, the Lord's been teaching me recently. We did a Sunday school class on the Sabbath, and The fourth commandment is observe the Sabbath. And I think Americans have largely forgotten what this even means. We think that observe the Sabbath means come to church on Sunday, which is partly true. But Sabbath is also about resting, stopping, being still, and listening. So how much silence do you have built into your week? How about a 24-hour period of stopping and resting? Don't miss this. It's a commandment, and the maker of the universe knows how we're wired, and so we probably need to take heed and listen. So if we're still, and we're actually able to hear his voice, what does he say? Or more importantly, what does he promise to give when he speaks? So now we're going to go back to Psalm 29 and see what God gives. So what his voice gives. So let's go, before we go to Psalm 29, let's go back to those Disney songs. Do you remember the petitions or questions that they asked? The first question they asked is questions of person. Who am I? What is my identity? Questions of place. Where am I going? Or questions of purpose. Why am I here? Now, these are all really good questions, but as a Christian, perhaps we could reframe these questions as the petitions that inhabit our thoughts and prayers. So first, questions of place. God, I don't know where I'm going. Where do you want to use me? Should I change my job? Should I move? Why am I stuck in this particular place, in this particular time in history? Or to quote the 80s song by Michael W. Smith, what is my place in this world? Or maybe questions of person. God, who'd you make me to be? I have these particular strengths and weaknesses, and who am I to be in this big world? I'm struggling with finding my identity, and in particular knowing how to distinguish right from wrong. And finally, questions of purpose. God, why'd you put me here in this particular situation? Sometimes it seems pretty rotten. I just don't know if I can go on without you revealing your calling to me. If I had a purpose, perhaps I could find the energy or life to go on. So when God's people hear God's voice in Psalm 29, they're given two things in verse 11. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. His voice brings strength and peace. Don't always get the answer to those I want questions of person, place, and purpose, but as Christians, we are promised strength and peace. So let's talk about strength for a second. Remember how God initially responded to Elijah? After he'd slept and replenished his sleep, which a lot of us are sleep deprived, he prepared him that meal. And I think so often we take our physical needs that are being met for granted. This morning I woke up and was reading the New York Times, and they did an interview of somebody in Ukraine who'd been in Ukraine, and they kind of said, well, what is it like to be on the ground? And in the East in particular, people are huddled in basements. They're not going to work, and they're just trying to meet basic needs. They talked about how 400 people shared a toilet and how they would carry the water to the toilet just so they could flush it because they don't have running water. They don't have power, so they're using generators, and then they're just trying to find food to eat. And so all things that most of us probably didn't think about this morning. So God meets physical needs and gives us strength. But remember, Elijah was depressed, and he had lost all motivation for living or ministry. He's lacking spiritual and mental strength. Do you know what that feels like? So I have taken up a new sport, thanks to my daughter, which is climbing. Some of you know this. And when I say climbing, I'm not meaning going outside and climbing a rock face. I haven't done that yet. But I go to a climbing gym. And the walls are about 12 to 15 feet tall, and you have to use holds and feet. And sometimes you hang kind of perpendicular to the ground, and sometimes you hang sideways. Sometimes you have to jump to a ledge. All those kind of things. And so the reason why I'm telling you this is climbers have a term called pumped. And so those of you that climb, my kids are climbing recently, know what pumped means. And so pumped means this. So you have to strategically approach a wall and navigate the wall carefully, because if you aren't careful, you'll run out of strength. And so I have often been like one or two holds from the top, and I'm pumped. And what that means is my muscles are barely holding on. And I know if I reach, I'm going to fall. I just don't have the strength of my fingers or arms anymore, so my muscles are pumped. And I bring up that to tell you that that is how some of us feel sometimes. We feel pumped, whether it's physically or mentally or spiritually, we're done. We don't have the energy to reach for the next hold. And so the verse that makes me think about when God whispers to Elijah and meets him in his pumpedness, that's not a word, I made that up, is Isaiah 40:31. And you all know this verse. But they who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they will walk and not grow faint. See, when we look to God, we find uncanny strength when we wait or rest in him. And this is the beautiful promise of his word. So, but I want to spend a little bit more time, and we're wrapping up here, on peace, the other thing that's promised in this passage. About a month ago in the U.S. News and World Report, they did an article on a study that was recently released by the American Psychological Association. And this isn't going to surprise any of you, but they polled about 3,000 Americans, and they've been following Americans, and they asked them what has them stressed out. And so here's what the people that were polled said. 87% said they were worried about the rising cost of food, energy, and other everyday items. 81% supply chain issues, 81% global uncertainty, 80% Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 80% potential Russian cyber attacks or nuclear threats. In addition, 63% said their lives have been forever changed by COVID. And so what this article said, and I'm sure some of those things have stressed you out or make you worried, is that they said it was stunning the amount of stress that Americans are under when they compared it to a survey in 2007. We're stressed out. We're in this lost in this big scary world, and we're pumped mentally. We don't have the energy to go on. The people that you encounter at the coffee house or at work, they're done. And they don't have peace. So I was listening to a sermon recently by a local pastor. His name is Peter Hubbard. And he said, how does the world give peace? And so this is a quote by him. He says, the world gives peace when you can finally buy the house of your dreams or have your dog running around in the backyard and your BMW in the garage. Peace. Or when you hang out with people who get you. Peace. When your TikTok followers or Instagram followers follow you double in a month. Peace. When your political candidate wins and finally begins enacting his or her agenda, I feel peace. When my society affirms my chosen identity, peace. When my family is watching TV rather than arguing with one another, or when my kids are in bed and I can get a drink of my choice and put my feet up on the couch and relax, peace. When my doctor says the scan is clear, and when I feel good about the way life is going, and that is how the world gives peace. So are all these wrong? No. Many of these are gifts from God, but they're not what Jesus is talking about when he offers peace. So what type of peace does Jesus offer? We recently celebrated Easter, and we gathered on the Maundy Thursday service and remembered what it was like to be in that upper room right before Jesus died. And in John 14, you'll see some of the things that Jesus tells his disciples. And the title of that chapter is Jesus Comforts His Disciples. But in John 14:27, he says this, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I don't give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and don't be afraid. I think that's what we need to hear this morning. Jesus is offering a different kind of peace. What is the focus of his peace? Don't let be troubled, your hearts. See, our world is topsy-turvy right now. As I said, everyone's anxious and stressed out. Our hearts are troubled. We're shaken. We're much afraid. But Jesus goes to the heart of the matter. If there are fires, he promises to walk with us. If our world shakes, he will hold us steady. As the storm blows, he will speak, peace, be still. His voice gives strength and peace to our troubled hearts. I want to draw your attention to one more thing that John 14 says. At the very beginning, it says, don't let your hearts be troubled. And then he starts to talk to the disciples, and he starts talking about how he's going to go to heaven, and the disciples are really confused, like they were most of the time. And Thomas is like, God, we don't know where you're going. Tell us where you're going so we can follow you. And Jesus answers him in verse 6, y'all know this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You see, all those questions that I mentioned at the very beginning, those prayers and petitions, are answered in this simple phrase. So questions of place. God, I don't know where I'm going. Where do you want to use me? Why am I stuck in this particular place in this time in history? What is my place in this world? Jesus says, I am the way. Or how about person? God, who did you make me to be? I have these strengths and these weaknesses, and I'm struggling to find my identity. I can't tell right from wrong. Jesus says, I am the truth. And finally, purpose. God, why did you put me here in this particular situation? Sometimes it's pretty rotten. If you could just reveal your calling to me, maybe I could find purpose or energy or life to go on. And Jesus says, I am the life. Don't you want this life this morning? This promised peace and strength? Jesus is that life, that strength, that peace. He doesn't offer that transitory peace that comes and goes in the world. He gives us a sustaining peace that goes to the heart of things. He is the Prince of Peace. And so, saints, take his hand this morning and join him, and let not your hearts be troubled. Let's pray.